How did you prepare for the Keystones, or how did your teachers prepare you?
From what I remember, we went over like quizzes and like questions before the Keystones, and I also like persevered throughout like the whole course of the year to pay attention.
What would you have wanted to know before taking the Keystones that teachers didn't tell you?
I feel like we go over like the hardest questions in class, but like Keystone questions are like kind of like simple and just like straight to the point. So I feel like I overthink questions sometimes. So if they like give us more like straight to the point questions, that would help.
Do you think it's harder than the PSSAs, or do you think it's exactly the same?
I don't really remember the PSSAs. That was a while ago. I just always hate like standardized tests because like they're timed and stressful and like overwhelming. Yeah.
And what advice would you give to new test takers for their first time?
If you have like a long prompt, read like the last sentence first so you know like what the question's about, and then go back and read the full question so you have like you know what you're looking for. And if like for me personally, like skim through, like don't read too in depth into it unless like you need to know like that certain information. So
How did you prepare for the Keystones, or how did your teachers prepare you?
My teachers prepared me by giving like example like prompts and like doing them and then giving us feedback on what we did good or what we did bad, and then I just kind of like took those corrections and apply them.
What would you have wanted to know before taking the Keystones that teachers didn't tell you?
Probably more like the multiple choice part. Like I feel like we work a lot on the open-ended, but like what like multiple choice questions will they ask? Because I feel like those are always like harder in my opinion.
Do you think it's harder than the PSSAs, or do you think it's the same?
I think it's slightly more difficult, but like fairly similar comparison.
What advice would you give students taking the Keystone for the first time?
To not overthink about what's going to be on it because you do know the information, and if you do good in school, you'll be fine.
How did you prepare for the Keystones, and how did your teachers prepare you?
We've been going over like open-ended prompts and having multiple choice questions with that match the prompt. But other than that, I haven't really studied much on my own.
What would you have wanted to know before taking the Keystones that teachers didn't tell you?
Probably the fact that they're like challenging us more than what actually we're going to be tested on, because I think they make it much harder than it actually will be.
Do you think it's harder than the PSSAs, or do you think it's relatively the same?
I think it's relatively the same, probably with just a little bit more complex since we're like in higher grade, but yeah.
And what advice would you give students taking the Keystone for the first time?
Don't stress yourself out too hard. The practice is much harder than the actual Keystone. Yeah, and you don't need to worry. It's not that big of a deal.